Welcome. Welcome to our speaker series this Wednesday. My name is Catherine Baker. I'm the new director of the UC Student and Policy Center. And today's program is a continuation of a great series that was set up by the UC Center Sacramento director, Dr. Richard Kravitz, who is here. And so I want to thank him again for foreshadowing such a great speaker at such a great time and making it so timely. Professor Richard Hasson is professor of law and political science at UCLA. He is also director of UCLA Law's Safeguarding Democracy Project. So something that I hope will be in your questions is some of the work that he's doing there. He is an internationally recognized expert in election law and actually has written some of the leading casebooks in election law for all those lawyers who are trained in election law and go out and practice as well. He's been a commentator. You may recognize him from CNN in 2020 on election law. He was a commentator and analyst there. Election law analyst, I think is the right title. And then in 2022, he was at MSNBC and NBC in some real key commentary in two very important election cycles. And he's also a significant blogger. The Election Law blog is a must-follow blog, and some of the topics that I've seen today I think are already foreshadowing your questions, such as, can Vice President Harris use the campaign funds that are so much the topic of conversation right now? And so we couldn't have a more timely topic and a better internationally recognized election law expert to speak with us today. And on a personal note, he's met my voice. Over 10 years ago, he was on Michael Krasny on KQED radio in the morning and talking about voter ID laws and election impersonation or the lack thereof at polling locations and election administration questions. And I phoned in, and I'm sure you recognize my voice from that time. But it's just because it's a great topic and we have a great expert. So please welcome Professor Richard Hasson.
Thank you. I've got this mic.
Oh, you've got it.
Good afternoon. Everyone hearing me all right? Great. Good to be with you all. And thank you to Catherine and to Richard and to the staff here for inviting me. I was going to speak for about 40 minutes. I'm going to try and keep it a little shorter because in my experience, everywhere I go these days, people have a lot of questions. I don't know if you've noticed, there's been a lot of stuff in the news happening that usually doesn't happen. So, questions about the upcoming election. But I want to talk a little bit more broadly about what it means to have free and fair elections and why the kinds of things that we took for granted in the past, we can no longer take for granted. So as Catherine said, I've been blogging since before blogging was popular, and now I'm blogging now that blogging is no longer popular. I'm still doing it. But I remember a blog post I put up in January of 2009 when Barack Obama took office, taking over from George W. Bush. Bush, conservative Republican, Obama, a liberal Democrat. And what I remarked is, in this post is how we just take for granted peaceful transitions of power. Here you had this huge difference in policies between Bush and the Iraq War and Obama, who was going to change health care. Nobody was asking, is George W. Bush going to leave office? And I said, we just assume that we go in and we vote and everything's going to be okay. And we shouldn't take that for granted, is what I wrote in 2009. And today, I think we don't take it for granted. In fact, today, there's a lot of panic about our election system. And so I want to talk about, how did we get here where we have these issues and we have this anxiety about how our elections are run? What's coming and what can we do about it? So that's what I'm going to talk about. And the title of the talk, I've already left the title slide, is Losers Consent. And let me just explain what that is before I get into the details here. Losers' consent is a political science concept, which is, how does a democracy work? You might think, well, democracy is just about people going and voting, and they show up, they vote, the winner's announced, and they just take office. And in fact, if you think about how a society works, it requires that the people who lose the election, people on the losing side, accept the results as legitimate. look, I'm not happy that my side lost, but let's reorganize, and in 4 years, we can make things better. Loser's consent is the idea that you accept the results as legitimate, and you might fight about it, but you agree to move on. And that's what's in danger now. We have a situation where there are tens of millions of people who believe the false claim that the last election was stolen. And how can you have a democracy? How can people accept the legitimacy of the current government if they believe that current government was not legally put in place? So that's what loser's consent is about, and that's what I'm talking about today. So how did we get here? So most of you in this room are too young to remember the disputed 2000 election. This was an election between Bush and Gore. Bush the Republican, Gore the Democrat. It was a very close election. And it all came down to the Electoral College votes in Florida. At one point, when they were counting and recounting the ballots, there was a 537 vote difference out of millions of ballots cast. And lots of people voted using really bad voting technology. Voting technology that's so bad that we think about 1 million people who voted in that election in the United States didn't have their votes counted because the technology was so bad. I don't know if you've ever seen these punch card ballots. If you ever come to UCLA Law School, stop by my office. I have one of the old machines in my office. I used to bring it to class, but it's falling apart now, so students make a pilgrimage to the machine. But this was state-of-the-art technology in 1940 that was still being used in 2000 to cast ballots. And so you would take a little metal piece of, a little metal stick, you would poke it through a piece of perforated cardboard, and then the cardboard papers were run through a machine to count the ballots. And what if it was not completely punched out? If it was like just indented, that was a dimpled Chad or a pregnant Chad. Sometimes it was falling off, it was a hanging Chad. This was the obsession of America. And it turns out what we learned from that 2000 election was that our elections are decentralized. Every county is using a different election system. We have political officers, partisan officers running elections in lots of the country, not nonpartisan. And it's in close elections, the rules of the game really matter. So there was a ton of litigation. It ended up at the Supreme Court. At the last minute, the Supreme Court divided along ideological lines, with the conservatives saying, we're not going to count any more votes, Bush is the winner. And one of the lessons that got learned from that election is the rules of the game really matter, and so people started fighting about the rules more. Legislature started passing new laws, and people started litigating. And in fact, the amount of litigation, the amount of the number of cases that are actually being heard by courts in the election area has almost tripled in the period since 2000 compared to before 2000. We set a record for the most litigation ever in the 2000 election. So it's become a regular part of our election system that everybody's going to court. And in fact, I'm speaking here. I just left. I was speaking to a group of judges from the Ninth Circuit. They're having their conference in town. And it's all about, are we ready for the next wave of election litigation? So not only do we have this litigation, not only are the rules being changed because people think that in close elections the rules matter, we started getting these theories that are coming out of each side. There's a lot of voter suppression, there's a lot of voter fraud. Voting itself became a political issue, the same way that abortion or the environment or immigration. And so that's not really healthy for an election system when everyone is questioning these things. And so every 4 years, all of a sudden, people like Professor Kravitz call me up and say, can you come and speak? It's very cyclical. Are we going to be able to get through the next election? And so I want to say that that's not normal. That's not how it is around the rest of the world. Most other countries, when they're talking about their national elections, they have an independent, nonpartisan election administrator that runs elections. If you go to Canada and you vote in Winnipeg, or you vote in British Columbia, you vote in Toronto, all the machines are the same, the ballots look the same. Nobody's worried. Take the UK, where they fight a lot about things like Brexit. they're not fighting about their election system in the same way, right? So we have this decentralized partisan election system. So that was bad enough. But then things got much worse in the 2020 election because Donald Trump started making unprecedented claims of fraud and election rigging. He had been making these claims going back to 2016 when he lost in the Iowa caucuses. He claimed that the election to Ted Cruz, he claimed that election was rigged. When he won in 2020, he claimed the election was rigged because Hillary Clinton, who lost the Electoral College vote, she won the popular vote by about 3 million votes. And Trump went on TV and told ABC's David Muir that there were 3 to 5 million non-citizens that voted in the election, all for Hillary Clinton, he said. Not one for him, all for Hillary Clinton. And there was an extensive investigation. So were there 3 million non-citizen votes found in 2020? Not 3 million, not 300,000, not 30,000, not 3,000, not 300, not even 30 confirmed cases across the country out of, over 100 million ballots cast. So a very small problem. But what Donald Trump did was undermined people's confidence in the process. And when he lost in the 2020 election, he went through a series of maneuvers to try to turn himself from an election loser into an election winner. And basically the idea was, when we vote for president, it's not a popular vote. It's not whoever gets the most votes wins. You have to win the Electoral College votes, the majority of the Electoral College votes, which are assigned to each state based on population. And the Electoral College is kind of controversial. It's not really my topic today, and some people think we should have a popular vote. But even if you think the Electoral College is fantastic, the way that we translate how people vote into how Congress counts the Electoral College votes, that part is really messed up. And so Trump was trying to exploit some of those rules to say, well, even though there are some states, he looked at states where Biden won, but where there were Republican majority legislatures. In those states, he said, there was fraud, there were irregularities. The legislature should come up with a separate slate of electors, and they should submit those electors to Congress. There was a kind of full court press to try to get these different electors to meet. I'm sure you've heard at least some of this. Some people who were Trump electors in these states that Trump lost, they would have been official electors if he won. They still met, they gathered, they sent their material to Washington, D.C., and they wanted to have their votes counted. And so this didn't work. We know how this ended. It ended with 62 lawsuits. Donald Trump lost 61 of them. He won one lawsuit on a very minor point. And then it culminated with the invasion of the Capitol after Trump gave a speech and others gave a speech saying the election was stolen. Invasion of the Capitol when? When Congress was counting the Electoral College votes, when they were actually going state by state. One of the things that happened is Mike Pence, the vice president, he refused to do what Trump wanted, which is to say, I'm not going to count the votes from Arizona. I'm not going to count the votes from Pennsylvania. And you may have heard that some of these invaders of the Capitol were chanting, hang Mike Pence. Right? Why hang Mike Pence? Because he wasn't willing to go along with election subversion. So this is a new problem in American politics today. We've had these voting wars, we've had these fights over the voting rules, but it wasn't the threat of violence, and it wasn't the idea that the election winner was not going to be able to take office. And so the upshot of this, if you look at polling, something like 59, 60% of Republican voters will say today that the last election was stolen. Now, I've spent a lot of time looking at the claims. There is no basis to say that the election was stolen. Not proof of mass voter fraud anywhere. There are claims of irregularities. Let's talk about that. So here's an example of an irregularity, just so we understand the kind of thing we're talking about. Do you remember in 2020 when we voted? It was during COVID. I'm sure you all had, have terrible memories of thinking back about how, when people were voting in person, there was plexiglass, everybody was wearing masks, there were long lines, 6 feet distance. A lot of people voted by mail. Right? So in Wisconsin, for example, election officials said, because of COVID, the mails are not working very well. We're worried if people put their ballot in the mail to mail their ballot, it's not going to get to election officials in time. So what we're going to do is we're going to let people vote. We're going to have a dedicated drop box. Right? We have them all throughout California. I know where I live in Los Angeles, you see them in front of libraries. They're very secure. And so election officials said, we're going to set up ballot drop boxes. So people can, rather than use the mail, and election officials will come and they'll collect the ballots. And so there were some claims of fraud, that ballots were being stuck into the machine, into the drop boxes that were not valid. Those claims did not pan out. There was a movie called 2000 Mules about supposedly using geo-tracking technology to show these false ballots being dropped off. Not only was that not proven, but the people who produced the movie have now apologized after they were sued for defamation. So no proof of that. But the argument was, the technical argument was, well, those drop boxes, that wasn't authorized by the legislature. Therefore, everyone who voted this way, their ballot should be thrown out. And because more Democrats voted that way, Trump should actually win the state. That was the legal argument that was being made. And one of the problems with that argument, there were many, but one of them was, it was known for months that they were going to use drop boxes. And nobody filed a lawsuit saying it was improper. They waited till after the election, saw that they lost, and then they filed their lawsuit. And the Wisconsin Supreme Court said, you can't disenfranchise people this way. If you have a problem before the election, you need to deal with it before the election. Okay, so those are the irregularities. So what we saw was attacks on election workers, claims that the election was being stolen, and now, today, we go into the next election where people are worried, are we going to be able to have a peaceful transition of power? Are we going to be able to have a fair election system going forward? Now, some things have gotten better. So in 2022, there were a number of people who embraced the false claim that the 2020 election was stolen, and they were running in partisan elections in places like Arizona and Nevada to be the Secretary of State, to be the chief election officer of the state. Though in those swing states where they ran, they all lost. So I think that's good news. It shows that people, Democrats and Republicans, are not willing to come together and vote for people who are going to claim the last election was stolen. It would be very scary to have an election where the votes are being counted, supervised by someone who claimed the last election was stolen without any good evidence. So that's good news. Also, the Congress passed a law called the Electoral Count Reform Act, passed it in 2022, and that law said, it said, we have Congress, we have all of these rules about how we count the Electoral College votes. We're going to change those rules to make it clear, for example, that the vice president doesn't have the power to just throw out the votes. By the way, who's the vice president who's going to be in charge of the counting of the Electoral College votes this time? Maybe why some Republican supporters talk? Kamala Harris. She's the vice president. She's going to be in charge maybe of counting her own ballots. What kind of, nowhere else in the world do we have a system like this. So it's just pointing that out. So Republicans and Democrats have a good reason to fix those rules. And the Supreme Court decided a case called Moore versus Harper in 2023, where they rejected one of Trump's kind of off-the-wall legal theories about how state legislatures are the only ones that can set the rules for conducting federal elections, and they can't be limited by governors or by state courts or anything like that. So some of these things are positive, but not enough. So if you think about, after the invasion of the Capitol, Trump was impeached. There were 10 Republicans who voted to impeach him, along with, I think, all of the Democrats who voted. Of those 10, 8 are no longer in Congress. Most of them have either lost their primary or decided to retire. Right? There's been a purge. If you want to be a loyal member of the Republican Party today, you have to say whether or not you believe it that the last election was stolen. And if you're willing to say that, what else are you willing to do? There were 158, I think, members of Congress who after the Capitol was invaded, hours later, in the middle of the night when they were voting, still objected to the counting of Pennsylvania's electoral college votes on grounds that there was fraud or something like that. So that's pretty scary stuff. That the kind of the orthodoxy of the Republican Party today, following Donald Trump, is that the last election was stolen. And again, there's no good evidence of that. And so, what does that mean for our elections going forward? One of Trump's chief campaign officers was interviewed during the Republican National Committee, and I can't remember what the question was. It was like, are you prepared for Election Day? And his answer was, Election Day is not the end, it's Inauguration Day. It's like, yikes! Election Day is like, that's when you're done campaigning, and now let's count the votes fairly. But now we're going to be litigating, we're going to be potentially demonstrating till we get the result that we want. And Trump, of course, has said, unless he wins, it's got to be because it's rigged. One of the big questions is this a Trump-specific phenomenon, or is this going to continue after Trump is gone? And if Trump actually wins the election, are Democrats going to accept that result? Are they going to be giving losers consent? Or are they going to believe it's because of, whatever kind of suppression or whatever things they might be able to point to show the problems with the election? So how could we have a problem with the next election, whether or not it's going to be fairly conducted? One thing that's possible is that you could have election officials not fairly count the votes. Now, this is the usurpation of voter choice. This idea that maybe election officials are not going to fairly count the votes. This is not something I really worried about in the modern era. We used to have a lot of fraud in our elections. You know about Lyndon Johnson in the 1948 Senate race? Have you heard about this? It's a very close election. He was a little bit behind till the votes came in from Alice, Texas, small little town. All the votes came in for him, and everybody's signature was identical. So somebody had just forged all the signatures, and that put him over the edge. We used to have a lot of fraud, but since the 1960s, 1970s, not really any fraud in terms of election officials being involved in messing with our elections. But is that something we need to worry about again? One of the things we learned from what happened in 2020 is that so much of our election system depends on people following norms. Right? A lot of things are not written in the rules. So for example, back in 2020, in Michigan voted. Biden beat Trump by about 120,000 votes. That's what the election officials reported. They reported to a board made up of 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans that was supposed to certify the vote. What do? It's kind of ceremonial. They sit around, they look at what's come in from the Secretary of State, and they say, okay, Biden's won. The Electoral College votes in Michigan go to Biden. But one Republican voted no, and the other Republican was being pressured to not do it. Now, if they would have rejected it, then there would have been a court battle, and I think eventually the courts would have forced them to accept it. But so much of this, we have this nice ceremonial thing. Democrats and Republicans get together and they sign this thing. Actually, this is another place to try to manipulate the results. And so we need to be thinking about these things. This is not just a problem in Michigan. This is a problem in Shasta County, California. We have election officials who want to move to get rid of all the voting machines, which we know is a less accurate way to count elections, to do it by hand, out of fear that our elections have been stolen. So can we trust election officials? And so we need to have enough checks and balances to make sure that we can. We can worry about, I mentioned the certification issues. What about software issues? We had an election official in Colorado who gave the access to the software that is used to count the ballots to the MyPillow guy, Mike Lindell. She's now being criminally prosecuted for releasing this. But again, the things that we assume are okay. We can't assume that everything is just going to be fine. The other thing I'm worried about is violence. I mean, we saw the horrible violence against Donald Trump perpetuated just a couple of weeks ago. Seems like 5 years ago. I mean, so much has happened in politics. Right? It was not even 2 weeks ago that happened. We've had violence against election workers. We've had violence and threats of violence against voters. Just to give two examples, just this week there was a story about an 80-year-old man putting up a pro-Trump sign who was run over by someone deliberately because he didn't like his political opinion. I mean, that is not a healthy democracy. Another example, in 2022, there were ballot drop boxes that were set up in Arizona and for early voting, and there were people in camouflage suits with automatic weapons who were standing in front of the ballot boxes to prevent fraud. Voters had to go to a federal court and get an injunction to stop the intimidation of voters. Right? So this threat of violence is a real problem and one that's pretty new to the United States. Right? In other countries where there are not established democracies, unfortunately, violence is a way that elections get resolved. But today, this is now a problem in the United States as well. Can we trust, you know, when January 6th happened, the National Guard came in to assure that Congress could actually conduct its vote and declare Joe Biden the winner. Can we trust the National Guard? Like, these are not questions that we were asking even 10 years ago. Okay, so now that I've cheered you all up, what are the possible things we might do about this? So some of what we can do is improve election laws. So for example, in every state and in every county, because elections are run on the county level, not on the state level, in every county there should be rules about chain of custody. You should know, once people vote, where do the ballots go? There should be transparency. I know that in Orange County, I used to teach at UC Irvine, the registrar there set up 24-hour cameras. So you could watch a live feed anytime, you know, having trouble sleeping at 3 o'clock in the morning, want to make sure your ballot's okay, you could log on and you could watch. But like, why not, right? The only reason why not is like, maybe if you're an election worker, you don't want your face on there. I was just I told you at this Ninth Circuit panel, and the judges were talking about threats against judges. Right, so we've got to balance some privacy issues, but transparency, chain of custody, and also auditing. Talk about what sounds like a boring topic. It's very important, right? So we use machines to count ballots. So, you know, when you go to vote in November, you're not just voting for president, right? You're voting, probably you're going to vote on 30 to 40 things. If we were going to count all those by hand, you know, California already takes too long to count its ballots. If we were going to count those, by the time we're done counting, it would be time for the next election. Right? So we can't just do that. So what do? You use machines. Well, how do you know that the machines that are counting don't have some software glitch that's going to add some votes? You know, yes on Proposition 3, or, you know, to favor this side or that side. Well, scientists have developed they're called risk-limiting audits. Depending on the closeness of the race, there are ways to tell whether or not an election, a set of ballots have been fairly counted. And sometimes you do full count. So one thing that's happened in Georgia, remember Trump was saying in 2020 that the Georgia election was stolen. Remember he called the Secretary of State there, Brad Raffensperger, and asked him to find 11,780 votes. That was recorded. That's part of the criminal case against Trump that may or may not ever be heard. Georgia, the Secretary of State there said, let's recount every ballot for president by hand. And they did it, and they came pretty close, within a few hundred votes, which out of millions cast is pretty good. You have to actually be even closer if it's an extremely close race, but when someone wins a race by thousands of votes, you can check it out. So we need better audits. I think longer term, we need rules that make it less political in terms of who runs our elections. You know, back in 2000, back in Bush versus Gore, the Republican Secretary of State had to make a lot of decisions about how the recounts were going to be conducted, and every decision she made favored Bush, the Republican. And there was an attorney general in the state who was a Democrat, and he started issuing opinions coming out on the other side. Right? Senator Padilla Alex Padilla used to be the Secretary of State here. Did you know that in 2020, when he was still Secretary of State, he was honorary co-chair of the Biden for President campaign? Like, isn't it weird to have the chief election officer be taking sides in an election? I don't think that should be allowed, but yet our laws allow it. I also think we need to increase criminal penalties for people who tamper with election machines, people who commit violence against election workers or against voters. There's some important cases coming up through the courts dealing with these issues. And we need to have rules about election speech. And here what I'm concerned about specifically is disinformation about when, where, or how people vote. Let me tell you about a case that's pending in an appeals court in New York right now. There was a guy in the 2016 election named Doug Mackey. He was a Trump supporter. He posed as a black woman activist and sent messages to black voters telling them that they could vote by text or social media hashtag. And about 5,000 people tried to do this. He was prosecuted under a law that goes back to the 1880s. And now the appeals court is deciding, does this law apply to him? If so, does he have a First Amendment right to lie to people about how they can vote? And so I've argued that the First Amendment should be understood that lots of campaign lies, when you say, my opponent has raised taxes, I don't think we want to criminalize that. Let the political process work it out. But if you tell people Democrats vote on Tuesday, Republicans vote on Wednesday in order to get people to not vote, that should be a crime. And so I think we need to be going after that. And I don't think there's a First Amendment problem with doing that. So some of what we can do is fix the law. But law, and this is, I'll end on this point and then we'll turn to the Q&A. Law only goes so far. Right? Law's not going to protect us if there's enough determination to try to overturn the results of an election. If enough people in Congress say that there's fraud, even if there's no fraud, what are you going to do about it? You think the Supreme Court's going to solve that problem? So there are limits to the law. So one of the things I'm trying to do at the Safeguarding Democracy Project is bring together Democrats and Republicans and others who disagree on policy. They can have different views on immigration or different views on taxes or abortion or whatever, but they agree we should have free and fair elections. It's really important to build civil society, to build the capacity to say, you know what, we can disagree on a lot of things, but we have to agree that we're going to have fair elections. That's the way to bolster a loser's consent. It's like, get local people, business leaders, church leaders, union leaders, whoever the leaders of the community, get them into election offices before the election. Let election administrators show them how the process is working and let them be the ones to vouch in their local community and say, I believe this election administrator is running a fair election. So a lot of what we need to do in order to preserve our democracy is not about changing the laws. Changing the laws is important, but it's not enough. We need to bolster our civil society and make sure that people, first of all, that we hold fair elections, but also that people believe we hold fair elections. As I said, it's very hard to know if this is a Trump-specific phenomenon or not. But the fact that Trump has now picked a vice presidential nominee who's willing to repeat his claims about the 2020 election makes me very concerned. And so I'm hoping that we get past this moment. People ask, are you optimistic? It's like, ask me in 10 years. If we can get through the next 10 years and this generation can take over, I'll feel a lot better. Because the current generation, I'm not so confident. Politics has gotten nastier in this country, but it's crossed a norm line in a way that it hadn't before. And so really, when we think about our democracy, I think today it's true that we don't take our democracy for granted anymore, and now the question is, what do we do about it? And so I'm hoping between law and politics there are things we could do to try to bolster our democracy and give people the confidence that the election's being fairly run. And with that, I think we're turning it over to Q&A.